Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Team Made Apart podcast Season 2 is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2 Relationships Squared. Also, financial support comes from teammadeapart.com. Leveraging 20 plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Team Made Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Team Made Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammadeapart.com/talent. That's teammadeapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our happy little podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammadeapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be in any amount and go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammadeapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thank you for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Team Made Apart podcast. This week we have special guest Angelique Slob. Angelique is a future of work catalyst, people and culture strategist, speaker, and founder at Hello Monday, a consultancy which helps HR and business leaders lead strategic discussions and drive workplace transformation. As a remote work advocate, Angelique believes that remote working should not be the goal in and of itself, despite some major strategic advantages, but is rather a consequence from a results-driven, autonomous workplace design that is actually essential for knowledge workers and innovation. Here to discuss the shift from the industrial age to the information age, how management styles must adapt when they rely on the worker's expertise, introducing flexible working conditions, developing a culture of trust, and so much more, please welcome to the show our guest, Angelique Slob. Hi, Angelique. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Hi, Ryan. I'm fine. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here. This has been sort of a match in the making for some time now. I actually had invited you to season 1 of our podcast some months ago. And for a number of reasons, scheduling conflicts and things, we weren't able to make it work. So I'm really grateful to have you back this season. And I think there's so much to talk about. The world has changed since I first was introduced to you.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of things happened since the last time we spoke.
Yeah. So I guess, Angelique, let's start at the beginning. Let's just kind of talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you do here in the remote work space.
Yeah. So actually, my background is in human resources. I've been a human resource executive for over 15 years in a variety of multinationals. I worked as an interim manager, so I saw a lot of companies. I probably switched like every year or a year and a half after a new project, moving on to a new company. At that whole same period in the Netherlands, we had the movement, the new way of working, which was all about flexible working and being more location independent. So the idea is people working where they want, when they want, delivering their best results for their company, and companies giving them more autonomy and flexibility. So basically, in every company that I worked, I was always involved in that area because I strongly felt and believed that it was the way forward, and it would really solve a lot of problems I saw in the people and culture space in traditional corporate companies. At the same time, I also saw that a lot of companies struggled with actually implementing this. So there were like implementations. something we can now see on a more global scale in moving to remote. So there was people were allowed to work more often from home, but there was like still control and command mechanisms in place. So moving towards a culture of trust and managing on the results truly was something that I always saw that was usually lacking in those companies that were attempting to transition to these new ways of working. I also saw there were a lot of critics on the movement say this will never work because managers are afraid to lose control. And that was actually often stated as a law of nature, like gravity or the sun coming up every day. It's just like this effect of life. Managers are afraid to lose control, so this will never work. And I was challenging that statement big time. I was like, well, I'm not sure if that's true. And if it's true, I want to know why, because there must be a reason. Mm-hmm. It's not like, it can't be like that as a fact of life. So what is behind that mechanism that people are afraid to lose control, or people in managerial positions are afraid to lose control? So, and that question has been such a key question that has been putting me towards the journey of discovery. Now, the first thing that I did is when I went to university in the Netherlands, one of a very good business university, and I studied organizational sociology, and I was focusing on that theme, alternative organizational concepts, organizational change, organizational development. And I ended up doing research very specifically about the most optimal organizational context for innovative knowledge workers. Idea being that if innovative knowledge workers are not being managed on the results and do not get autonomy, like that must be even more difficult for other groups of people. And I found that 80% in my research, which was a qualitative research, 80% of the managers didn't apply the most optimal management style. So, and that's quite a significant number. Okay, this is 7 years ago, but I think it was still in general true. You can still probably say 80% from the companies that you will encounter, also technology companies, also innovative companies, will not apply the most optimized management style. Mm-hmm. And management style comes with culture and organizational structure. So it's the whole organizational design.
Yeah, no,
so
that
after
makes a lot
that,
of sense.
Yeah, Ooh. After that, and it's very quite, actually I have a white paper written about it, so I'm happy to share that with your audience for the people who are interested in it. So I was thinking, well, it's quite interesting. It means that there's a lot of work to do in the world out there. And this also collided with my own desire to become more entrepreneurial, but also to become more location independent. So it ended up me starting doing a blog, consulting. I did a project here and there. I started traveling. I spoke to so many people around the world. I interviewed so many entrepreneurs, startups, really also very pioneers on new ways of working, very innovative companies, location independent freelancers. I went through like a whole real huge area of discovery and speaking to people. And that actually led to me being asked more often as a consultant and as a speaker. And then in 2018, I launched Hello Monday as a brand. And Hello Monday is, the idea behind the brand is to create a new way of world of work where people are actually saying hello to Monday, and where there's way more like work-life integration and where people can thrive.
Oh, I love that. Well, God, there's 100 things to unpack just in that little bit of introduction there. So thank you so much for that. First, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, I mean, you mentioned this key statistic, this idea that 80% of your managers weren't using the ideal management style. Mm-hmm. Do you mind digging into your white paper a little bit and sort of explaining what the different management styles are that you encountered, which you decided was maybe the best method, for working with these knowledge workers or sort of, distributed teams? And then, what is it that people are doing that they shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, so what I saw, and I can really talk about the Netherlands and cultures that might be similar. So what we saw, I used two models that are quite famous. So most people might have heard about it, and otherwise it's very easy to Google. It's the competing values model from Cameron and Quinn. And I used the model of Mintzberg about organizational structures. They both have one quadrant, like one model. In those models, they're like, there's both one area that's both called autocracy. And I did some study where, like in my white paper, you can see that we also we derived management styles from that. A good example of a manager that has that Socratic model, I should have used a different word if English is not my first language. that specific management style for autocracy, Steve Jobs is a good example. It's a visionary leader who looks at the future, who makes connections on the outside world, very driven by technology and by the things that's happening outside, allowing people, giving people a lot of space. What you can see in, for example, in the Netherlands, the dominant culture is the family culture and the family style that is much more internally focused. So it is about creating team cohesion, and it is about creating, taking care of each other. There's nothing wrong with that, because you need all those different management styles, but you need to balance them. And like what I saw, a lot of managers said to me in their interviews, my primary management role is to make sure everybody is happy and performing well. And then I can move outside having a more external viewpoint. And basically you should do that the other way around. Mm. So be more out there. And I think a lot of startup founders, for example, do that by default because they have to. They have to go and talk to investors and find partnerships. So they usually leave people with a lot of more autonomy, and also a lot of more focus on these are specific results that we need to get to. So you see, startup cultures adopting that management style and organizational culture more naturally. And also, we can also see a lot of those startups starting off remotely. It's easier. Mm-hmm. And it's just also because they fit that organizational context a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, especially if you're talking to, older, more established firms who are now trying to make a change or something, or a shift in culture. I imagine it's much more difficult to do with an established culture than it is maybe if you're starting from the beginning, mm-hmm. and maybe in an industry or doing a type of service that really lends itself to working distributed. Exactly. So that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned too that one of the struggles, and maybe this is a piece of this familial style of management that's so prevalent in the Netherlands, I think you mentioned that it's difficult for managers to sort of relinquish trust or relinquish control. And so it makes it really difficult for people to build this, I guess, trusting culture. And, in a familial structure, I mean, it makes sense that there should be some component of trust, right? I mean, obviously, if everybody's happy and this is what you're pursuing, you should sort of trust people a little bit, but it does lend itself to sort of a top-down trust, right? Like, I'm the leader, I'm the father of this place, or I'm the mother of this place, and I'm here to take care of all my little, worker bees or whatever. And so maybe that trust isn't sort of reciprocated, it's on mm-hmm. me, and you all should trust me. But as the manager, it's difficult for me to then pass that down to you so that I can trust all of you. And so maybe talk a little bit about sort of that culture of trust and sort of, how it relates to this familial style that you noticed as being so prevalent, but also, how can we start introducing more levels of trust? I mean, I think some of it is just a little blind faith, but maybe you have some suggestions for us.
Yeah, so interestingly, if I would explain that in a more like sociological way, an organizational sociological way, I would, the issue of trust, I would look at the dominant management paradigm that we have, which is that people cannot be trusted, or at least employees cannot be trusted. It's the whole idea that we for more than a century, we have been programmed to believe that there is an uneven, an unequal power balance between an employer and an employee, and that their interests are not equal. So in the industrial time where we hired employees, they were selling their time and their labor, physical labor, in exchange for money, for compensation. The idea behind that management paradigm is that employees are trying to not give their best. So as a manager, it's the whole command and control management style. It's like knowledge is power. It's labor division. So people were put to work and the manager was making all the coordination. Everybody needed to do their own piece. And they didn't even have a total overview from the work they were doing, like the actual results. That is not increasing engagement. It's actually diminishing a lot of engagement. And even before the industrial age, people would have been way more involved and engaged with their normal work, like craftsmen or like laborers or people even like working the lands. But that industrial area changed really a lot in the way we were looking at organizations and that employer and employee relationship. So what you can also see is that 8-hour workday is a factory workday. It's 8 hours optimized for repetitive work where people are just doing physical labor without thinking. But more hours is actually would decrease their productivity. So it didn't make sense economically to pay people for 9 hours a day because that extra hour would not give the same return on investment. And then we see that we still use this management paradigm, first of all, in an era where people do not sell their time and their labor, but they sell their knowledge and their skills. They're actually not even selling that because it's not something you can sell. That makes a major shift in the power balance. It makes it way more equal. So that traditional employer and employee relationship has shifted, but the way we think about it, the paradigm is still the same. So that is problematic. There we see conflicts arise. And that is also connected to those, for example, the 8-hour workday. Because the first offices, they were connected to the factories. It was the sales people, it was the financial department, the typists, all the ladies, remember in the big rows, sitting there typing, whatever they were typing. And they had to follow the same work hours as the people in the factory. Well, their work is by definition something very different. If we move fast forward to today's age, we expect people to work 8 hours a day, even go to a place to do that work where we use technology. And we still also have this paradigm, this programmed mindset that we cannot really trust the people. And it's not something that we should blame each other. We shouldn't blame managers for not trusting their employees, because it's something that is so deeply rooted in our current culture still, that I think it's the best way to change that is to acknowledge this, that this is how we all been programmed, and help each other to change that, but not in a judgmental way. That sometimes I see that happening, and I think we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, no,
even saying like,
right.
you know, oh, if you don't trust your employees, you shouldn't be hiring them. It's not that simple. And
well, and
not,
like you said, if we're living in sort of this paradigm where our whole world is sort of shaped in a certain way because of the, you know, post-industrial revolution or, you know, whatever. I mean, if we've got sort of this framework that we're operating within, sometimes we might not even recognize the problems, you know.
Exactly.
I mean, so this idea that we should be, you know, trusting people or don't hire them. I mean, like, you know, we're operating from this one mode, you know, that we've got to sort of work through. I wonder have you seen in any of the research you've done or any studies, like, are there certain cultures or certain parts of the world that seem to be better about this or worse about this? Like in terms of sort of, you know, lending to this? I mean, maybe this is a stereotype I picked up from somewhere, but as I understand it, the Netherlands specifically has been a little bit more on the vanguard of, you know, remote work and you know, flexible working, you know, really back into the 70s and maybe even sooner or earlier.
Yeah, I think they had like, sorry.
Yeah, and so I wonder, you know, like in a culture like in the Netherlands where they've been doing some version of this for a long time, you know, if ultimately we just have to put in a certain number of hours before we'll break our paradigm and shift into something new. Like, have you noticed that, for example, maybe in the Netherlands, it's, the culture of trust is perhaps a little stronger than in some, lesser industrialized part of the world.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it has to do with industrialism. I do think in general, the culture in the Netherlands is more equal. It's more egalitarian culture. And also that idea of working more flexible has been around for a longer time. So democratized working concepts, organizations, there have been experiments all over Europe. Like, I'm not sure, but probably also in the US. There must be, I don't know them, but there's always been companies that said, okay, we are going to work in a different way. For example, there are companies that are owned fully by their employees. Mm-hmm. So all the employees have staff, or have stocks. So you can see that there's been different concepts and creating more autonomy, or even solving more problems. For example, Kaizen, which has been developed in Japan. So you can see that certain organizational concepts are being at least experimented with in companies, even for decades. And the command and control and not trusting the image of people, that's always not been the only one. There's always been complementary ideas about people, but they can sometimes conflict, like within different managers, different departments, but also within ourselves. I do think in certain, for example, the Northern European countries, Western European countries, I can see more trust, a longer tradition of giving flexibility and autonomy, where that is, for example, fairly new in a country like Portugal. Mm-hmm. So I think like last year I saw a report that it was like only 3% of Portuguese people were like having some way of remote and flexible working. So this was before pre-COVID, where that number was way higher in the Netherlands, going up to 50%.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's my experience too. Like with Spain, as an example, we have a small office over there in Spain that's all fully remote, but that's certainly not the norm over there. And especially in sort of the pre-COVID days, right? I think Spain's number probably very similar to Portugal. I think it was about 4%. And mm-hmm. So it makes sense to me that there's some change. And I even look at sort of, like there's sort of this equalitarian sort of culture in the Netherlands, for example, but like here in the country or in the US, for example, there's a lot of, I guess, sort of pride taken in outworking other people. So there's sort of this competition all the time, that there's something to this working harder than somebody else and all that stuff. And I wonder if this plays into that role of trust, in that, when we tie someone's performance to the money we're paying them, then we have like reason to be suspect, right? If you're not doing enough work or whatever, then you're cheating us somehow.
Yeah. When did you, Ryan, before you go, when did you have your best ideas?
Oh God, I don't know. I always have them at weird times, in the mornings, in the showers, in the, wherever, in the car, those kinds of things, and almost never in the office.
No, and exactly. But still we pay people to sit in the office, and we take away the opportunity for them to get a really good idea.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And maybe it makes sense at this point to talk a little bit, in your white paper specifically, you're talking about knowledge workers. You do mention that, because there's not a lot of like literature around this, or at least not back at the time when you wrote your white paper, you were just sort of treating knowledge workers as workers. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just sort of what is a knowledge worker for people who are having trouble thinking about this. And maybe it's everybody. I mean, maybe we're all trading knowledge, but I mean, there's, certainly people who are still working in factories and trading time from labor. But I wonder, when we're talking about this category specifically of the knowledge workers, who are we talking about?
Yeah, I made in my white paper, in my study, I made a division because this was my first thing. I had to come up with some kind of description of what is a knowledge worker, at least in relationship to my research. So I made a distinction between two groups, and one of the groups is like the professionals that are teachers and doctors and lawyers, that also follow certain rules within their own community and their profession. And there is the innovative knowledge worker, so I call it usually the innovative knowledge worker, that doesn't have to follow like certain rules within profession. For example, you don't want your heart surgeon to start like experimenting while you're on the table having open heart
Right.
surgery, you know, hopefully
Yeah, no.
not. While having somebody in your technology firm, yeah, definitely. It's one of the best examples, the 20% that Google gave their employees to use as free time within a certain context. Like they said, okay, you know, you can work on projects that are like, you know, specified in such and such areas, and people would come up with the best ideas, and that some of them actually made it to being very successful and profitable products. Giving that space is important for knowledge workers to create and to come up with new ideas and to find solutions for problems. So finding new solutions, which is innovative, has a specific, and there's loads to say about the other kinds of professions, but this is just what I specialized in. So we also work mostly with innovative companies or highly professional companies at least. But I would advise differently for a law firm or like a high-tech firm for sure, because it just requires a different context. And I think if you are working in an innovative company, or you have maybe a traditional company, a factory, but there's an R&D department, you have to create a different culture within the R&D department or in like your overall innovative company, and giving them space is very important. So I am not, my starting point has never been remote or people working away from the office. My starting point has always been, what is the culture of trust and a culture of managing on the results? If you allow people to work at the place and at the time that they can deliver the best results, remote working is just a natural consequence.
Yeah,
I want you to solve my problem, and if you just go away and you go sit in the woods for 2 weeks and then you come back with like a genius solution, I'm happy.
yeah. Yeah, no,
I'm more happy than sitting at an office, going to meetings and not making any progress.
Yeah, well, and I think it's one of those like misconceptions that comes up a lot among sort of, I guess what you would call sort of remote work advocates or something. It's this idea that we must be all remote all the time. Everyone should be remote. And I think you do a really good job in your white paper, but also, you know, in other materials you've produced on this idea that sort of remote work is just work. Like, you know, and I like the way you put it. It's just sort of a consequence or a natural consequence to the, you know, nature of this style of work. And and I think that's great. And maybe it starts to lead into sort of this little next thing I want to talk about, which is, you know, are there some tools or are there things that as a manager I could start to employ to start making this shift into a culture of trust? You know, like I think some of it is, you know, I mean, if we're basically trying to overcome a paradigm or we're trying to overcome the way we see the world, you know, I mean, part of it, I guess, would need to be some sort of self-assessment and understanding that, you know, our management style so we could better relate to our people. But like, how could I as a manager actually start taking steps towards repairing this kind of problem? I mean, it sounds, you know, from your research and everything that's very prevalent, you know, there's this issue of trust is sort of cultural and endemic. It's everybody, you know, is experiencing this sort of thing. It's been true in my experience as well, even in more progressive companies where you would expect that they would be more loose about this kind of thing. There's still sort of this aspect of trust. In fact, I can cite one example, a company that decided, because all these other companies were doing the unlimited PTO or unlimited time off and that kind of thing. They ran it for about 2 weeks and then just pulled it back. They were like, no, like it was too scary. Like we had a couple people leave, you know, and take long breaks or whatever. And they're just like, no, we can't do it. It's too scary. And so, but, you know, so they tried, but ultimately it didn't work out that well, but it goes back to this trust, right? They had to have the faith in their people that their people would still get their jobs done and, you know, or handle whatever their responsibilities were, but it just didn't exist even in a company that was seemingly so progressive. Right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, do you have like, I mean, I hate to ask for like a checklist, but I mean, are there some actionable things that we as managers can do to improve?
Yeah, well, what I do, I love that example that you mentioned, Ryan, because I've been asking that to CEOs of companies and saying, just as a question to have like an idea about the levels of trust, or maybe we should move away from the word trust, but move away to freedom and responsibility of autonomy. So I would say, what would happen if we would implement unlimited time off with you next Monday? And then you can see some of the managers, like the CEOs, being sitting like back, really relaxed, and just say, "No, I don't think it would change a lot." And you see others like it's such a question that touches the paradigm. So it's a good question to ask each other. Sit around the management table, like with your leadership team, and say, ask this question. And you can see people becoming very nervous, or just sitting relaxed and saying, yeah, why not? But if you see people say, well, we are not ready for this, I'm not sure, then you touch this first point.
Yeah.
It's just good to acknowledge. I would also really encourage, especially if you're working in HR, if you work in a leadership position, to discuss this, to put this on the agenda, the management table, and just say, make the agreements to help and to coach each other on that area. So if you could feel uneasy or you feel uncomfortable in this area now, especially when people working a lot of distributed, and you actually feel that idea, like, I'm not sure if this person's doing what they're supposed to do. I feel as a manager that I should be seeing this person in person. Make that acknowledgement, and also make sure you have someone in your leadership team, or like one of your teammates or your peers, that you can actually relate to and talk to about it. So it's nothing wrong with you as thinking that. It's just normal because we're in transition.
Sure.
The other thing is, make sure, because we see people falling back into old solutions for new challenges, if you do not offer them a new solution. And the lack of having new solutions is forcing us to fall back to this command and control mechanism. And a great example of that was that I was working somewhere as an HR director, and everybody was like really high level. We had like officially flexible work schemes, but one of the VPs came to me and he said, I'm talking about this director that is in my team, and don't we have anything like in the manual that we need to have, like that people need to be in the office at 8:30 in the morning? And I kind of snorted, and I was like, I don't really understand your question. So I invited him to sit down, and I was like, okay, let's have a chat. So, and then he said, well, and I was like, okay, what problem would that solve? What is actually the actual problem that you want to solve? Because, and then it was like this person had such an autonomous function that the VP couldn't really see if he was performing right. So, and he didn't have any other way of knowing anything about the performance, or not sufficiently. So his natural reaction was say, okay, he needs to be in the office between 8:30 and 5, so I can see at least that he's here working. And I was like, okay, no, this person has to do like a lot of things, like international video calls in the evenings. And but let's talk about why do you have that need as a manager, and how can we provide you with, you know, the right information, because that's what you're actually looking for. So going to the core of the problem, and I was also speaking to a very progressive client of mine, and one of the VPs there says, well, it's interesting now, since we shifted to fully distributed, we now notice that we lack certain information that we need as VPs or as executive managers to know what's going on. And he said, interestingly enough, and I really love that self-reflection of him, he said, interestingly enough, it means that we have been using the wrong kind of information till now. So we've been managing based on information that is not essential, because now we find out that we lack essential information. So it is also about like really making clear, what do you need, what's happening. If we move really to results-driven cultures, you can see that you start to give new solutions to managers, and they don't have that feeling of, okay, I don't know exactly what's going on, what's been expected from me. I am a manager, but I don't know what does it mean, especially today.
Yeah.
So, and then if you just really give them or make managers work together in this issue and say, what do we need? How can we feel that we actually know that we get the right information, that we have the right people doing so.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point, actually. This idea of sort of understanding the metrics you need to determine success. So much like, so for example, I come from into remote work from sort of a freelance side. So I've been basically a 20-year freelancer, having worked from anywhere all over, that kind of thing. And so I don't have the same experience as like a remote worker who happens to work for a big organization or something, works for Twitter or something, but remotely. And so the needs of a freelance or the needs of a contractor are a little bit different, right? Because we have there's some urgency around money. We don't know where our next check's coming from. Like there's all these different problems, right? But one of the big things that's happening right now among freelancers and contractors is this shift out of hourly based billing to a value-based pricing model where all of a sudden you're selling, basically your knowledge. So sort of the same thing we're talking about here, but you're requesting a fee for your knowledge versus, being paid for the number of hours you work, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of parallels between that and this. And the only way that the value-based pricing models work is by really understanding what metrics matter. And I think so to the point you were describing, or in the situation where this guy is saying, well, we've been using all this data to make our assumptions, but we're looking at all the wrong stuff. Like, I think that, it makes a lot of sense when you start thinking about it, the things you would need to measure to understand the performance or the results-based version of your employee. If you really understood what metrics you were trying to move, or what, I guess, what needle you were trying to move, that might better allow you to trust your people, because you could have a measurable result that wouldn't then be tied to, number of hours sitting in a chair today, because that metric is not, valuable when, as it pertains to, did we, execute this phase of our, this sprint or whatever. And so, so I think it's really critical to understand that. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, it actually will change. Basically, you have to rethink your people processes drastically. And I think one of the things that I am really a big advocate is to let go of the 8-hour workday or the 40-hour work week, or whatever the work week is in your country, and move to flexible, compressed work days, but still have the value would be the salary, the full-time salary that you get. But if you can do that work in 6 days of 4 hours, or you do this work in 7 days, or you don't do it in 4 days, but or you do it like, I met this guy once who he had to quit his job because he loved to work like in one sprint of 3 days and nights. He would hardly sleep. He was IT, of course. And then he would just go on. And then he would take 4 days off and lie on the beach. And his manager, he wasn't Brazilian. And they were like, no, you have to be in the office between 9 to 5. And he was like, yeah, but I want to work these hours. And then he quit, and then they rehired him as a freelancer. And then he had the freedom to work, and he did exactly the same work, but they were more happy. So give that value, the value if you say, okay, this is the full-time. I love companies that have free Fridays, or say, okay, we experimenting with 4 days work weeks. But then it's still controlled within a time frame. So really, and especially now, people working from home often, or people have to still combine different responsibilities. People are learning how to work more remotely and distributed, and trying to do that in a 9 to 5 setting in their heads. It's problematic. So moving to this flexible, compressed work days is going to help companies and employees. There is a lot of research saying that for knowledge workers, 4 to 6 hours a day is optimized. Having the best ideas, if you say, I'm going to go for a walk in the woods because that helps me clear my mind, and when I come back, I probably have a solution for this problem, please do so. So as managers start to move towards those little things, even talk with your employees, talk with your team, create a discussion in your team. What do we need to optimize the work in our team? And organizations on organizational level, they have to broaden the context. There's no way you can create policies for the future. It's impossible. And even also governments, they should broaden their like labor law context, allowing more space for people. Of course, there's also industries and countries where protection of employees is highly important. So we shouldn't neglect that to just meet the needs of knowledge workers in technology. But those specific groups of people need a lot of autonomy, and it fits the organizational needs for innovation. It fits employee well-being, and it fits a more sustainable and equal world. So it's quite important that we start to actually make this transition.
Yeah. Well, and as we've already talked about a little bit, I think encouraging this flexibility, even if it's beginning with these technology companies and sort of the companies most equipped to do that
Exactly.
kind of work. I think ultimately that will start to trickle down, right? I mean, there's just different types of people do different types of work, right? For some people, they really thrive in an office environment and they want the ability to shut off at 5 p.m. and go home, I mean, and so those people need to have their place also, in addition to the people who, want to work 4 days really hard and then spend the rest of the week on the beach. And so, I mean, there's got to be room for everybody. And, and it is a challenge for employers to try and figure out how to meet the needs of everybody because the needs are so disparate. But I think,
are you only going to hire people that have that office need, so you can create your office culture, right? Or are you going to combine the different peoples, and what kind of culture and what kind of people processes are you creating if you start doing that?
Yeah.
So
well, and I think, the key word that we landed on earlier was this idea of flexibility. And so I think that's, the really critical thing, this flexibility and this autonomy. I wonder then sort of if we can segue into a little bit of, what's going on now in sort of this post-COVID world. I see all these people talking about, the future of work and the new normals and all these things. And I'm not convinced that we're going to just wake up one day and we'll have this new normal. I think it's actually much more likely that it, just like everything else, is in transition, and we will find out where we land in a couple of years, but that will be different than where we are in 5 years. And so I think it's sort of always in flux. And I think it's important that we sort of maybe embrace this fluidity and stop looking for a solution to a problem, because it's kind of this ongoing issue. And, we've just got to figure out how to navigate this. But I suspect in the sort of the before times, before COVID, I imagine that your approach, at least as a consultant, would have been a little bit more phased, right? It's work into this, it's solve problem after problem and sort of evolve. But with COVID and all of a sudden this rapid movement to remote, what are you seeing people struggling with now? I mean, basically, if they had trust issues before, are they overcoming them with, in rapid succession because of how quickly we've adapted to remote work? Are you seeing problems or issues for people? Like, I mean, are you seeing any real change in the way that you might advise a company now in sort of this quick reactionary version versus, if we could be a little bit more measured and have taken more time to work through these processes?
Yeah. The starting point that I've the conversation with surely changed. So before this, I was like two things. The approach was looking at the organizational strategy, and then saying, okay, this could be like the right organizational design, and feeling like how ready or willing a company would be to move towards that, or at least in what speed. Where companies would usually be saying, okay, we start to implement little things, little steps. Obviously, things have accelerated, and you can see now a lot of companies first having to do crisis management on an operational level, making sure things work. And now I see two things happening. I see companies still struggle with mainly people processes, so like day-to-day work, communication. That's been sorted. I do think the trust in general is being on that operational level. Okay, we know this works, we know how to do it, but what's next? And you see this tension of people wanting to go back to the office and coming up with this. A lot of them come up with a solution saying, okay, we go hybrid. This is a logical next step. Where they say we can either ask people what they want, or we are allowing everybody to work from home 2 days a week. These kind of solutions, I'm sure you have heard a lot about companies saying that. Where I would say both of them, I think, are problematic and also a missed opportunity. I spoke to CEO and asked him, he said, well, I want people to be in the office for 2 days a week. And I'm like, okay, what is that 2 days? What is the base, the background, the rationale behind that decision? And he said, well, because like I want to feel, to see, to hear, it gives me, as a manager, enough base and personal connection to be able to manage them effectively. I said, okay, so that means that the decision that you make for your organizational design is based on your personal management needs. Well, we look at the organizational strategy and we can see that they actually would very benefit from a remote first setup. Talking about that, I advise a lot of companies to say, to understand that this hybrid model, it is a logical next step, but it's not the status quo. And we need to make sure that the hybrid model gives them enough agility and means to move forward, but also to leverage all the strategic advantages of a fully distributed team, even if they not choose to be fully distributed at this moment. Yeah. So remote friendly is where we can say, oh, everything goes back to normal, but people can work from home a little bit more often than they did before. That's remote friendly. Remote first is everything is by default. We came through this transition. We invested as a company in a big transition. We didn't want it. We didn't choose to do it, but we did it. We spent a lot of time and energy and resources and money to come to this point where we are just learning to do this effectively. There's an economic recession coming up. I would just say, move forward on this path and do not turn back. It doesn't mean that you have to give up on the office totally, but go and say, okay, we still move towards this default distributed setup, but we offer people, obviously, the opportunity to work in a co-working space, to meet in the office on a regular basis, to be more flexible in the locations where they work. But if we need to go back to another lockdown of 3-4 months, it wouldn't be a problem. If we suddenly start to say, hey, let's actually start hiring on the other side of the world, because we are distributed anyway, we are so used to working remotely, we can actually do that. Then you also can leverage your strategic advantages for the future. Yeah. So really looking at, for the next steps, looking at those strategic points. What do you need? And if you have a management need, if you say our managers really feel like they want to see the people in the office because it's the way how they have been taught to manage, it's the way that they've been doing for 20 or 30 years. Acknowledge that there is a training need to be effective as remote leaders in a remote first situation. Mm-hmm. And the second thing that's really important is that as a company, now is the time to further empower your people so they shape their own way of working instead of doing this top down, creating policies. Yeah, because it's not going to work.
Yeah, well, and I think you used the right word, right? I mean, it's so much about attitude and perspective, but I mean, looking at what's going on with COVID as an opportunity, right? I mean, because at this point, it seems like most companies have probably had an employee or two come to them about remote working or about, some flexibility in their relationship, or they want to be able to move, or work from home a couple days a week or whatever. Like, I mean, they've probably had these requests up to, the time that we all went remote. Mm-hmm. And so I imagine that most of these things weren't at least foreign concepts, but maybe it was sort of the push off the cliff that we needed, to really establish this. But one of the things that I've noticed, and maybe you can back this up, or maybe, I mean, you sort of touched on it, is just sort of this idea or this intention to sort of go forward with remote. Because I think that there's still a lot of people, and honestly, this is something we've uncovered in sort of our mental health podcast, which is that people whose intention is sort of set back on going to work the old way, right? They still have a toe in the office. Those guys haven't fully embraced remote. They haven't fully worked on what they needed to work on to be successful as a remote or a distributed teammate. And they have run into situations where, now they're feeling, different emotions or different ways. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they just didn't set themselves up right to go remote. And then, so I guess at the organizational level, if you are a manager who's just been sort of holding out hope that you're going to come back to the office at some point, and because of that intention, you haven't put all the work into going, making the full transition to remote, you might have sort of set yourself up to fail a little bit, or set yourself up to at least be slower in this transition than you could have been. I think you will also find on the opposite end of that spectrum, there are plenty of companies that have wholly embraced this, gone completely remote, and now they're going, well, what do we need all this office space for? What are we doing? And so I think that you'll probably find a spectrum of stories, both good and bad. But I think looking at this as an opportunity rather than this negative, shift, I think will help people out. So to sort of transition into the next step, into the next topic here, I want to talk a little bit about whose job it is to sort of drive these initiatives. So, I mean, ultimately, you expect your leadership to step up. I know you have a lot of background in HR, and so maybe you have a perspective that would be, maybe this comes from HR. But, I think in order for us to really make this meaningful change, like, somebody needs to be driving it. And I wonder if you have any kind of perspective or ideas about who should be driving this, who should own this sort of stuff, and how we actually go about implementing it.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think obviously HR is a very important stakeholder. I have an HR background, so I am also setting up an HR mastermind group for HR directors of larger companies in tech, to help them, to support them in a group, in a mastermind setting, to step up in that leadership position, and to help the companies to align, to lead a strategic discussion, to align vision, and to actually drive change. Because I do think that HR is a very important stakeholder, and it's important for them to step up in this, to really own that and lead that, because it's their expertise, and it falls into their responsibility. However, future of work is not something that you can do as one person in the organization or one department, especially not as an external consultant. So one of the things that I changed from my former, like, some consultancy projects where you were like called in as the expert, and you were like driving change or advising people about what they should be doing. Now I'm just also step back from that role and saying, actually, it's not possible. I am here to help people to develop their future of work leadership skills. And that is not just HR, it's not just the leadership team, it could be an employee, it could be a team lead, but it's even like, I would say it's even the girl next door that is the one that needs to drive the change, because it's something, we are all part of this. And I think that's something that COVID really showed. Nobody could have done this by themselves. Every company went through the transition where they had to say to people, look, you have to make it work, and we trust you to make it work. So people started to shape their own ways of working. And it was probably the only reason that we could have done this so quickly. Imagine that an HR person was going to write a policy. Okay, this is what we're going to be doing. And they had to go to procurement to find the right tools and the right systems. And then some implementation manager had to go and implement it. Well, it was impossible. This was like a shift we had to make almost overnight. And the only way to do that is to empower the people to say, okay, look, just have to make it work on an individual level, a team level, or a department level. And then companies like HR need to back up. Of course, crisis management is one thing. Creating something for the long term that works for the organization requires also knowledge and certain skills. It's not easy, and I know that I've been in HR, it's not easy to have your voice heard in the leadership team, because there are often such different perspectives driven by business needs, client needs, or like shareholder needs. So it's very difficult to have the organizational development perspective on the table. But now it's the time to align people and bring that into the discussion. So empowering team leads who can work with their teams and say, look, what do you actually want? What do you need? What do you expect from us? How can we make this work? And that is the future of work. So people will be asked to be part of the solution and not just sitting backwards and say, okay, I have to see what the company is doing and what the new policy will be. And then we just adjust to it, because it's not going to work.
Well, yeah. And I think that sort of brings our whole conversation full circle, right? Is this idea that, because of having been sort of pushed through this COVID change, we've been forced to make some radical decisions. So whether it began as crisis management and now, because there's kind of not a clear end to this crisis, right? I mean, you don't really know when or if everything will go back to the way it once was, and it probably won't. It's forced people to maybe loosen up, and I think maybe become a little more reliant on people. And so I really like that perspective, or this attitude that, I mean, as bad or as scary as sort of a global pandemic is, the ability for us to all sort of rise up and come together through this, really sort of shows our humanity. And I think if you can take that and sort of, express that or foster it, or the word you used was empower it in your employees and in your teams, I think you're going to be in a much better situation going forward. And and you almost can't help but change, and almost can't help but become more trusting or become more people first.
And we have to be, we only, like, I think it's not just about COVID, because if we look at the first half of 2020, like the first 6 months only, we had a climate crisis where people were calling companies and governments to take care of like CO2, decrease CO2 emissions. Then COVID happened and people were like, okay, we need to have more flexibility in remote working. And then the Black Lives Matter protests were like global protests. We have never had the same global developments at the same time happening. 3 major global protests, worldwide protests in 6 months' time. And
yeah,
I say protest, COVID, like it's not a protest, but after that, people like starting to say, okay, I have now realized that I have different needs than I used to have. Our needs are not necessarily the traditional company needs. And those 3 things, they call for employers to change, for companies to change, to become more sustainable, to increase diversity, and to become more remote and flexible. And we cannot just ignore that and thinking, or we can just go back to normal with an adjusted work from home policy. It's not sustainable. So if you look at those 3 major developments, they're not new, they were there. Yeah. But they've been accelerated extremely in 2020, and we're only halfway there. So this truly is a year of transition. It's a tipping point. Yeah. And if you draw the line further to the future and you say, if we were to move on this path the first steps we took, where is the future? The future is going to be very equal, because we can hire people from all over the world. So they can get access to the same opportunities. People that have combined work, like family obligations, or that are disabled, they can have access to or that want to work remotely, they can have access to the same opportunities. So there's equality. Then there is the de-urbanization and less pressure on the urban areas. That also brings economic growth to more remote areas. And that will increase the more sustainable world for us all. And it's more diverse as well, and people will be heard. Because if we work together online asynchronously, but everything is documented, it doesn't really matter what your background is or where you come from, because people will not have that idea about, okay, but we are all the same in the same area, in the same office, we have come from the same schools, and that will become more equal and more value-based. And I think that is such a future that is giving us tremendous opportunities, and creating such a different world. That is the era of technology, and technology is driving this. We have everything is happening at the same time, but we can also talk about it at the same time. And I'm like, your podcast is international, and I hardly have to think, there's something different here in Europe than it is in the US, because we're more or less in the same, we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And actually the picture you paint is actually very hopeful, right? I think there's so many people caught up in sort of the fear or the unknown, like there's a lot of people who are worried and stressed out right now, and there's so much going wrong. But I think the way that you just described it sort of puts it in a light that really does seem hopeful. As things, yes, it's a shift, and yes, it's a change, and yes, it was dramatic. But but we'll all come out of this better off, and maybe, at least as far as our work lives go, maybe it'll be much more, it will sort of check all those boxes that you described. We'll be much more capable of being diverse. We'll be much more capable of being, all encompassing and working through the needs of our people, and so I think, I don't know, that's maybe the most hopeful spin I've seen on 2020. Because, everybody is so quick to just kind of shoot it down as like, God, everything that could go wrong has gone wrong, and I think the reality is, it's sort of just what you described, is that, everything that went wrong could have gone wrong, but it was all there before, it's just been accelerated. And as a result, we're going to come out of this thing and be ready to rock. It might take 6 months, might take a year. We don't know. But ultimately, the change that is going to be brought on by 2020 is going to be really impactful for our futures.
Yeah,
I think that's exactly. A great note.
Yeah, and I think, it's not going to be easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but yeah, there is hope. Like it is. This very well could lead to a better future. I'm actually convinced that it would be, and of course, transition is painful, and I'm here, and I think that you as well, and many people in the community and change agents, and also in the community of Hello Monday Club, because the like-minded people, we are finding each other and supporting each other to bring that change and to help other people, to help ourselves, because it's also scary and stressful for us. It's
Sure.
Scary for everybody. But if we can support each other and give each other resources and share our messages and our knowledge, then we can help each other go through this transition in the best way possible.
Yeah, no, I love it. I don't think we're going to do any better than that, to be perfectly honest. That's a great little message of unification there at the end. I love it. So Angelique, just in closing, where can people find out more about you? Where can they find you online, and perhaps connect if they felt so inclined?
Yeah, so my company is called Hello Monday Club, hellomondayclub.com. People can subscribe, can join the community. There's lots of free content. People can connect with us also on Instagram and LinkedIn. And my personal LinkedIn profile is Angelique Slob. It's also very easy, SLOB. So I'm easy to find. I'm always happy to connect with like-minded people, and so feel free for people to reach out and send me additional questions. And if there's anything I can do for people, I'm here.
Awesome. Well, and we'll be sure to include all those notes or all those links in the show notes, and make sure that everybody can track you down. Angelique, thank you so much for doing this. I'm really thrilled to have had the opportunity to catch up with you. And I can't wait to catch up with you again.
Ryan, really, thank you for the opportunity. It was my pleasure. And yeah, we'll talk to you. We'll be in touch for sure.
All right. Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody who tuned in this week and every week. And we'll see you all next time.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know